How did a decade obsessed with freedom end up creating movies so disturbing some countries still refuse to show them? The 1970s didn't just break Hollywood rules, they shattered moral boundaries with chainsaws, revenge fantasies, sadistic killers, and violence audiences had never experienced before. Some viewers fainted, others walked out sick. A few films were banned for decades. Tonight, we're diving into the exploitation movies that crossed every line imaginable, and the terrifying reason audiences could not look away. The Baby, 1973. Some movies shock you with blood, but The Baby shocks you with pure discomfort. This is the kind of 70s exploitation film that feels strange before anything dangerous even happens. The story follows a social worker who investigates a wealthy family keeping an adult man in the mental state of an infant, complete with a crib, baby clothes, and disturbing household control. On paper, it sounds impossible to take seriously. But that is exactly why it works. The movie traps viewers inside a bizarre domestic nightmare where every polite smile feels suspicious and every room seems to hide something worse. Instead of relying only on violence, it creates tension through humiliation, manipulation, and psychological unease. That made it one of those cult films people remembered not because it was loud, but because it was impossible to forget. The real shock is how calmly everyone behaves around something so deeply wrong. The Baby went too far by turning a family home into a twisted social experiment and somehow making the audience feel like they accidentally walked into a secret nobody was ever supposed to see. Foxy Brown, 1974. Foxy Brown does not whisper revenge. It kicks the door open wearing style, rage, and danger. Pam Grier became one of the defining faces of 70s exploitation cinema because she brought something bigger than shock value to the screen. She brought presence. The film follows Foxy as she takes on criminals, corruption, and exploitation after personal tragedy pushes her into a violent fight for justice. What made it so powerful was not just the action, but the attitude. This was a film built around a woman who refused to be helpless in a genre that often treated women as victims first and characters second. But the movie still lives inside the rough, uncomfortable world of exploitation filmmaking, with sleazy villains, harsh situations, and revenge scenes designed to provoke strong reactions. For audiences at the time, it felt bold, confrontational, and dangerous. For modern viewers, it is both empowering and undeniably messy. Foxy Brown went too far because it turned pain into payback with no apology and proved that exploitation cinema could be outrageous, political, stylish, and unforgettable all at once. Female Prisoner, Der 701 Scorpion, 1972. Before revenge cinema became polished, Scorpion made it feel like a scream trapped behind prison bars. This Japanese exploitation classic follows Nami Matsushima, a woman betrayed, imprisoned, abused, and transformed into a near-silent force of vengeance. What makes the film so striking is not only its harsh subject matter, but the way it turns suffering into visual fury. The prison setting becomes a nightmare world of cruelty, power games, and survival. Yet the movie is filmed with bold colors, theatrical shadows, and almost surreal intensity. It does not feel realistic in a simple way. It feels like rage painted onto the screen. Meiko Kaji's performance became iconic because she says so little, but her stare carries the weight of the entire film. The movie pushed boundaries with its violence, prison exploitation themes, and emotional brutality, but it also gave its heroine a mythic power that made audiences remember her long after the credits. Female Prisoner, Der 701. Scorpion went too far by dragging viewers through a system built on humiliation, then turning one woman's silence into one of exploitation cinema's loudest acts of revenge. The Hills Have Eyes, 1977. A family road trip should not feel like a trap, but The Hills Have Eyes makes the desert itself seem hungry. Wes Craven's film took the fear of getting lost in the middle of nowhere and turned it into something primal. The story follows an ordinary family stranded in the desert, where they are stalked by a violent clan living outside society. What made the film hit so hard was its ugly simplicity. There is no safe city nearby, no authority arriving in time, and no comforting moral order. It is survival stripped down to panic, dust, screams, and desperation. Coming after Craven's already controversial work in the 70s, this movie carried the same raw nerve. Civilized people can become savage when pushed hard enough. The violence shocked audiences, but the deeper discomfort came from watching a normal family slowly lose its normal rules. It was not just about monsters in the hills. It was about what fear does to everyone. The Hills Have Eyes went too far because it turned the American wilderness into a battlefield and suggested the line between victim and predator may be thinner than we want to believe. Don't Go in the House, 1979. This is not the kind of haunted house movie where ghosts do the damage. The real horror is human damage left untreated. Don't Go in the House arrived near the end of the 70s, when exploitation horror was getting darker, meaner, and more psychologically grim. The story centers on a disturbed man whose traumatic upbringing twists into terrifying violence inside his home. What makes the film uncomfortable is how it mixes slasher-style shocks with a bleak portrait of isolation, abuse, and mental collapse. The house does not feel like a spooky attraction. It feels like a place where pain has been stored for years until it finally explodes. Audiences expecting simple horror were confronted with something colder and more disturbing. A villain shaped by cruelty, acting out his damage in ways designed to unsettle rather than entertain. The movie became notorious because it pushed domestic horror into a harsher space where the walls feel contaminated by memory. Don't Go in the House went too far because it turned private trauma into public terror and made viewers feel trapped inside a home where every room was already ruined. Piranha, 1978. After Jaws made the ocean terrifying, Piranha asked a nastier question. What if danger came in swarms? This film rode the wave of killer animal horror, but it had enough dark humor, speed, and nasty energy to stand apart from simple imitation. The story follows genetically altered piranhas accidentally released into rivers, threatening swimmers, tourists, and families who have no idea what is coming. What made it exploitation-friendly was the way it took a simple fear and multiplied it. One shark was scary. Hundreds of tiny predators attacking at once felt chaotic, cruel, and almost impossible to escape. The movie leaned into panic, bloody attacks, irresponsible science, and public danger, turning summer fun into a nightmare with teeth. Directed by Joe Dante, it also carried a satirical edge, mocking authority figures who downplay disaster until it is too late. That gave the film a smarter bite beneath the shock. Piranha went too far because it turned vacation water into a feeding zone and proved 70s exploitation did not need one giant monster when 1,000 little ones could do the job even better. Dirty Mary, Crazy Larry, 1974. Some exploitation films went too far with gore. This one went too far with speed, recklessness, and pure outlaw energy. Dirty Mary, Crazy Larry takes the 70s car chase obsession and strips away almost every safety net. The story follows two small-time criminals and a fiercely unpredictable woman as they tear across rural roads after a supermarket robbery, trying to outrun police, roadblocks, and their own bad decisions. What makes the movie so addictive is how little it pretends these people are heroes. They are selfish, impulsive, and dangerous, yet the film makes their escape feel strangely exciting because everything moves with desperate momentum. The highways become a battlefield, the cars become weapons, and every turn feels like it could end in disaster. This was exploitation built for audiences who wanted engines screaming louder than morality. But beneath the chaos, there is a harsh 70s cynicism. Freedom is seductive, but it can also be stupid, destructive, and fatal. Dirty Mary, Crazy Larry went too far because it turned rebellion into a high-speed death wish and made viewers feel the thrill before showing them the cost. Eaten Alive, 1976. A dirty hotel, a broken mind, and a monster waiting in the swamp. Eaten Alive feels like a nightmare sweating under red lights. Tobe Hooper followed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre with another grimy descent into madness. But this time the horror was less realistic and more feverish. The story centers on a disturbed hotel owner who feeds victims to a crocodile lurking beside his property. On the surface, that sounds like pure creature feature madness, but the real discomfort comes from the atmosphere. The movie feels trapped in one filthy location where every guest seems doomed the moment they arrive. Hooper fills the screen with screaming colors, sleazy tension, and characters who look like they wandered into the wrong dream and cannot escape. It is exploitation horror at its most sweaty and claustrophobic, using animal attacks, human cruelty, and psychological collapse to create a mood of total decay. Instead of clean suspense, it offers panic and dirt. Eaten Alive went too far because it turned a roadside stop into a slaughterhouse, and proved that sometimes the scariest monster is not the animal in the water, but the man holding the gate open. The Candy Snatchers, 1973. This is the kind of 70s crime film that does not just shock you, it makes you wonder who in the story still has a conscience left. The Candy Snatchers follows a group of criminals who kidnap a teenage girl for ransom, only to discover the adults around her may be even colder than the kidnappers themselves. That twisted idea is what gives the film its ugly power. Instead of a simple rescue thriller, it becomes a cruel study of greed, neglect, and moral emptiness. The violence is not always loud, but the tension is deeply uncomfortable because the victim is trapped in a world where almost nobody acts with urgency or compassion. The movie belongs to the bleakest side of 70s exploitation, where society itself feels rotten and every character seems capable of choosing selfishness over humanity. It is not polished, glamorous, or comforting, and that roughness makes it feel even more dangerous. The Candy Snatchers went too far because it turned a kidnapping plot into something far more disturbing, a portrait of people so broken by greed that innocence becomes just another thing they are willing to bargain with. The Toolbox Murders, 1978. Before slashers became formulas, the Toolbox Murders made ordinary household tools feel like evidence from a nightmare. This late 70s exploitation horror film became notorious for its brutal premise and grim apartment building setting. The story follows a series of attacks connected to a disturbed killer, but what gave the movie its reputation was the way it transformed familiar objects into symbols of sudden danger. A toolbox is supposed to fix things. Here, it becomes the center of fear. That simple reversal made the film feel nastier than many cleaner horror pictures of the era. It was not hiding in castles, cemeteries, or distant forests. It was happening behind apartment doors, in hallways, and in places that felt ordinary enough to be real. The film's rough texture gave it a sleazy, urban anxiety that matched the late 70s mood, when many thrillers turned cities and buildings into traps. Modern viewers may notice its uneven pacing and blunt exploitation tactics, but its shock value remains part of its cult reputation. The Toolbox Murders went too far because it made everyday life feel unsafe, and reminded audiences that horror can be hiding in the most normal-looking room. The Driller Killer, 1979. This is not polished horror. It feels like a scream from a city falling apart. Abel Ferrara's The Driller Killer is one of those exploitation films that seems born from noise, poverty, frustration, and sleepless streets. The story follows a struggling artist in New York whose mental state deteriorates under financial pressure, creative failure, and the constant aggression of the city around him. What made the film infamous was its shocking violence, but what makes it linger is its atmosphere of collapse. The New York in this movie does not feel cinematic in a glamorous way. It feels dirty, cramped, angry, and unstable, like the walls are closing in on everyone. The punk soundtrack, low-budget texture, and raw performances create the feeling of a film made on the edge of control. It became notorious in the video era, partly because its title and imagery promised something extreme, and the movie delivered a grimy kind of urban madness. The Driller Killer went too far because it turned artistic frustration into violent breakdown, and made the city itself feel like the weapon that pushed a man over the edge. The Exorcist, 1973. Some horror films scare audiences. The Exorcist made them question what they believed was allowed on screen. Even though it was a major studio production, its connection to 70s exploitation comes from the way it pushed religious fear, bodily horror, and childhood innocence into territory audiences were not prepared for. The story of a young girl's possession became more than a movie plot. It became a cultural event, surrounded by fainting reports, walkouts, protests, and moral panic. What made it so powerful was not just the supernatural threat, but the emotional violation at the center of it. A child's bedroom, the safest place in a home, becomes the most terrifying room in cinema. The film forced viewers to watch doctors fail, priests doubt themselves, and a mother lose control of the one thing she was supposed to protect. That is why the shock lasted. It was not only about disturbing images, it was about spiritual helplessness. The Exorcist went too far because it dragged sacred fear into mainstream theaters and made audiences feel like they had witnessed something they were never meant to see. Fight for Your Life, 1977. This is not just an exploitation thriller, it is a pressure cooker of hatred, fear, and revenge that still feels dangerous to discuss. Fight for Your Life follows three escaped criminals who invade a family home and terrorize the people inside, turning the domestic space into a battlefield of intimidation and survival. What made the film infamous was not only its violence, but its ugly use of racism and humiliation as weapons of psychological assault. The movie was designed to provoke outrage, and it succeeded so intensely that it became one of the titles associated with censorship battles and Grindhouse notoriety. Yet underneath its harsh surface, the film also plays on a brutal audience question. How much cruelty can ordinary people endure before they fight back? That emotional engine kept viewers watching even when the material became deeply uncomfortable. It is a film built to make the room tense, not entertained in any clean way. Fight for Your Life went too far because it weaponized social hatred inside a home invasion story and turned revenge into something viewers wanted, feared, and felt guilty for anticipating. Hanzo the Razor the Snare, 1973. Few films announce their madness as confidently as Hanzo the Razor. The Snare, a movie where justice, absurdity, and shock value collide without apology. This Japanese exploitation entry follows Hanzo, a rule-breaking investigator whose methods are outrageous, violent, and deliberately offensive by modern standards. The film belongs to a strange corner of 70s cinema where samurai-era crime stories were mixed with sexploitation, political corruption, dark comedy, and extreme macho fantasy. What makes it so notorious is not one single scene, but the entire attitude of the movie. It keeps pushing further, daring the audience to decide whether they are watching satire, action, sleaze, or a full rebellion against taste. Hanzo is presented as a force who punishes corrupt officials and criminals, but the film's methods are so excessive that the line between hero and grotesque anti-hero becomes impossible to ignore. That discomfort is exactly why it remains infamous. It feels like a time capsule from an era that often mistook provocation for power. Hanzo the Razor. The Snare went too far because it turned law enforcement into shock theater and made justice look almost as disturbing as the crimes it claimed to punish. Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, 1975. Some exploitation films flirt with bad taste. Ilsa marched straight into one of history's darkest nightmares and turned outrage into marketing. Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS became notorious because it used a fictionalized Nazi camp setting for extreme exploitation, mixing sadism, power fantasy, and cruelty in a way that made even Grindhouse audiences uneasy. The film follows Ilsa, a brutal commandant figure conducting horrifying experiments and ruling through fear. Its shock was not accidental. The entire movie was built to provoke, disgust, and attract attention through forbidden imagery. That is why it became one of the most controversial exploitation titles of the decade. It was not trying to explore history with sensitivity or depth. It was using historical trauma as a weaponized backdrop for sensational cinema. For some viewers, that made it a cult object. For others, it crossed an unforgivable line. Either way, the film became impossible to separate from the debate around exploitation itself. When does shock become too cheap, too cruel, too irresponsible? Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS went too far because it transformed real-world horror into Grindhouse spectacle and proved controversy can make a movie famous for all the wrong reasons. Thriller, A Cruel Picture, 1973. Revenge cinema rarely feels this cold, this quiet, or this merciless. Thriller. A Cruel Picture follows a young woman whose life is destroyed by exploitation, addiction, and captivity before she transforms into a silent instrument of revenge. What made the film notorious was not just its violence, but its icy emotional style. It does not rush. It lets the damage settle. The result is a film that feels less like entertainment and more like watching trauma harden into a weapon. Christina Lindberg's one-eyed Avenger became one of the most striking images in 70s exploitation, influencing later revenge cinema with her controlled fury and iconic look. But the movie's harshness also made it deeply controversial, especially because it uses long stretches of degradation to justify the eventual payback. That creates the uncomfortable bargain at the heart of many exploitation films. The audience is made to suffer before being allowed to cheer. It is powerful, but it is also morally messy. Thriller. A Cruel Picture went too far because it turned victimhood into a brutal revenge machine, and forced viewers to ask whether justice still feels satisfying when the road to it is so disturbing. The Last House on the Left, 1972. This is the movie that made revenge feel dirty instead of heroic. Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left arrived like a slap to the face of polite horror audiences, taking the home invasion nightmare and dragging it into a world with no glamour, no safety, and almost no emotional relief. The story follows two young women who fall into the hands of violent criminals, only for the horror to later shift toward the victim's family and their brutal response. What made the film so controversial was not just its cruelty, but its rough, almost documentary-like texture. It felt cheap, raw, and uncomfortably close to real-world fear. Even its strange tonal shifts made the experience more unsettling, as if the film itself did not know how to process the ugliness it was showing. For 70s audiences, it was a shocking break from gothic monsters and elegant suspense. This was horror with dirty shoes, bad roads, and human evil standing in broad daylight. The Last House on the Left went too far because it refused to make revenge clean, and forced viewers to realize that violence does not become noble just because it happens to the guilty. I Drink Your Blood, 1970. Few films capture the lawless Grindhouse spirit better than I Drink Your Blood, a movie that feels like someone turned a moral panic into a carnival ride. This early 70s exploitation shocker throws together satanic hippies, small-town fear, contaminated food, and rabid violence in a plot so outrageous it almost sounds invented during a dare. But that wildness is exactly why it became infamous. At a time when mainstream culture was already nervous about counterculture movements, drugs, cults, and social breakdown, the film took those anxieties and exaggerated them into full-blown hysteria. It was one of the era's most notorious shock titles, especially because it pushed graphic violence in a way that made censors and audiences take notice. What makes it fascinating today is how shamelessly it exploits fear of outsiders invading ordinary America. The villains are not just dangerous, they are presented like a nightmare version of every parental warning about the late 60s gone wrong. The movie is messy, loud, and completely unrestrained, but that is part of its strange power. I Drink Your Blood went too far because it turned cultural fear into splatter spectacle and proved exploitation cinema could sell panic as entertainment. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. The most terrifying thing about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is not how much it shows, it is how real it feels. Tobe Hooper's film became one of the defining nightmares of 70s horror because it seemed less like a polished movie and more like damaged footage recovered from a terrible afternoon. A group of young travelers wander into rural Texas and encounter a family so grotesque, chaotic, and detached from normal life that the entire film begins to feel like a collapse of civilization. Despite its reputation, the movie often suggests more than it displays, using sound, heat, panic, and relentless movement to make viewers imagine the worst. That is why it hit so hard. The screaming, the buzzing machinery, the filthy interiors, and the sun-baked emptiness all create the sense that help is not coming because the world has already turned its back. In the 70s, audiences were stunned by its rawness, and its reputation only grew as bans, censorship fights, and cult screenings made it feel forbidden. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre went too far because it made horror feel physically dirty and turned one farmhouse into a place viewers still feel trapped inside 50 years later. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. At number 1 is the exploitation film people still argue about because watching it feels less like entertainment and more like surviving an ordeal. I Spit on Your Grave became one of the most controversial films of the decade because it built its entire reputation around violation, endurance, and revenge. The story follows a writer who is attacked in an isolated area and later returns to punish the men responsible. For supporters, it is a brutal revenge story about a woman reclaiming power from those who tried to destroy her. For critics, it is one of the clearest examples of exploitation cinema crossing into deeply uncomfortable territory, using suffering so extensively that the line between condemnation and sensationalism becomes hard to separate. That argument is exactly why the film never disappeared. It became banned, condemned, defended, re-examined, and discussed for decades because it sits at the ugliest crossroads of outrage and fascination. Its low-budget realism makes the experience even harsher, removing almost every protective layer between viewer and nightmare. I Spit on Your Grave went too far because it forced audiences to confront revenge after extreme cruelty and left them wondering whether the film was exposing violence, exploiting it, or doing both at once. The 1970s gave filmmakers freedom, and some of them used it to create movies so disturbing, controversial, and dangerous that audiences are still arguing about them decades later. Some became banned legends, others became cult obsessions too shocking to forget. But which one crossed the line the furthest for you? Drop your pick in the comments. And if you survive this list, subscribe for more forgotten cinema that Hollywood wishes you never discovered.